It was a bright, sunny afternoon in Maple Grove. Maple Grove was a tiny, sleepy neighborhood tucked away where houses sat in neat rows, and kids rode their bikes up and down the street. Nothing big or exciting ever happened there. The birds chirped, the lawn stayed green, and everybody knew everybody else. It was one of those places where you could leave your front door open and nobody would bother you. Well, almost nobody. That afternoon, Jack Riley was standing by his kitchen window, sipping a glass of cold lemonade. Jack was a regular guy, or at least, that's what everyone thought. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't drive a fancy car or wear shiny clothes. Nope, Jack was the kind of person who liked quiet days and simple things. He had short brown hair, a friendly smile, and a pair of old sneakers he wore everywhere. Most people in Maple Grove didn't pay much attention to him. He was just Jack, the guy who lived in the little yellow house on the corner. But Jack had something special. Out in his front yard stood a giant oak tree. Not just any tree, this one was 150 years old. Can you imagine that? It was older than your grandma, your great-grandma, and maybe even her grandma too. Its trunk was so wide you'd need 3 kids holding hands to wrap around it. Its branches stretched out like big, strong arms, spreading shade all over Jack's yard and even into the street. The leaves were bright green in the summer, and when the wind blew, they danced and rustled like they were whispering secrets. That tree was Jack's pride and joy. He loved it more than anything. Every morning, Jack would walk outside with a little watering can. He'd pour water around the roots and pat the bark like it was an old friend. Sometimes he'd sit under it with a book, just listening to the leaves move. That tree wasn't just a plant to him, it was part of his family. His great-great-grandpa had planted it a long, long time ago, back when Maple Grove wasn't even a real neighborhood yet. Jack's dad told him stories about it, and his grandpa did too. They said it was a tough tree, one that survived storms, droughts, and even a lightning strike once. Jack felt proud every time he looked at it. It was like a piece of history right in his yard. But not everybody liked that tree. Nope, there was one person who couldn't stand it, and her name was Karen Baxter. Karen wasn't just anybody. She was the president of the HOA. Do you know what an HOA is? It's like a club that makes rules for the neighborhood. They tell you how tall your grass can grow or what color your house can be. Karen loved being in charge of it. She walked around Maple Grove like she was the queen, always carrying a clipboard and a pen. Her hair was pulled back tight, and she wore big sunglasses that made her look serious. Whenever she talked, her voice was sharp, like she was ready to boss someone around. That sunny afternoon, Jack peeked out his window and saw her. There she was, standing right in front of his oak tree. Karen's lips were pressed into a thin line, and her nose was wrinkled up like she'd just smelled a stinky sock. She had that clipboard in her hand, scribbling something down real fast. Jack watched her, his eyebrows going up a little. He didn't say anything yet. He just stood there, holding his lemonade, wondering what she was up to. Karen looked at the tree like it was her worst enemy. She tapped her pen on the clipboard and muttered to herself. Jack couldn't hear her from inside, but he'd heard her complain before. Oh boy, had he heard her. Every time she walked by his house, she'd stop and stare at that oak tree. Then she'd march up to Jack and start talking. "This tree is too messy," she'd say, pointing at the leaves scattered on the ground. "Those branches are too long. They're a hazard." A hazard is something dangerous, like a hole you could trip in. Karen thought the leaves falling on the sidewalk were going to ruin the whole neighborhood. Jack never argued with her. He'd just nod his head and smile a little. "Okay, Karen," he'd say, nice and calm. "I'll think about it." But he didn't really mean it. He wasn't going to cut down his tree just because she didn't like a few leaves. That tree was special, and Jack wasn't about to let anybody hurt it. Not even Karen Baxter, the bossiest lady in Maple Grove. But here's the thing nobody knew, not Karen, not the neighbors, not even the mailman who waved at Jack every day. Jack had a secret. It wasn't the kind of secret where he was hiding a treasure chest or a superhero costume. No, it was something quieter, something sneaky. Behind his friendly smile and his quiet ways, Jack was cooking up a plan. His brain was buzzing with ideas, and his calm eyes were hiding something big. He wasn't just standing there watching Karen for no reason. Oh no, he was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment. See, Jack wasn't the kind of guy who got mad and yelled. He didn't stomp his feet or shake his fists. He was patient, like a cat watching a mouse. He'd let Karen talk and talk, let her think she was winning. But all the while, he was thinking. Planning. Getting ready. Something huge was coming, something that would turn everything upside down. And Karen? She didn't have a clue. She was walking right into it, step by step, with that smug grin on her face. Let's back up a little and talk about Maple Grove some more, because it's important. Maple Grove was small, like I said. There were only about 20 houses, all lined up along 2 streets that crossed in the middle. Jack's house was on the corner, with his big oak tree sticking out like a giant green umbrella. Across the street lived Mr. and Mrs. Harper, an older couple who liked to sit on their porch and watch the world go by. Next to them was Tommy, a kid who rode his skateboard everywhere. Down the road was Mrs. Lopez, who grew flowers so pretty you'd stop just to look at them. Everybody got along fine, well, mostly. Karen made things tricky sometimes. She'd knock on doors and tell people their mailbox was the wrong color or their dog barked too much. Most folks just rolled their eyes and did what she said to keep her quiet. But Jack? He was different. He didn't fight her, but he didn't give in either. He'd just smile and go back to watering his tree. That drove Karen nuts. She wanted everybody to listen to her, and Jack's quiet ways made her feel like she wasn't in charge. That afternoon, as Jack watched her from his window, Karen turned and looked right at his house. Her eyes narrowed behind those big sunglasses. She scribbled something else on her clipboard, then started walking up his driveway. Her shoes clicked on the pavement, click, click, click like a countdown. Jack put his lemonade down on the counter and wiped his hands on his jeans. He knew she was coming to say something. She always had something to say. The doorbell rang. Ding dong. Jack took a deep breath and walked to the door. He opened it slow, peeking out at her. Karen stood there, one hand on her hip, the other holding that clipboard tight. Jack, she said, her voice sharp like a teacher catching you chewing gum. We need to talk about that tree. Jack leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Oh yeah, he said, keeping his voice nice and easy. What about it? Karen huffed, like she couldn't believe he was asking. It's a mess, Jack. Look at all those leaves on the ground. And those branches they're hanging over the sidewalk. Someone could trip. It's against the rules, and you know it. Jack glanced past her at the tree. A few leaves had fallen, sure, but it didn't look messy to him. It looked alive. He shrugged. I don't think it's so bad, he said. Nobody's tripped yet. Karen's face turned a little red. That's not the point, she snapped. This is my neighborhood, and I say it's a problem. You need to trim it, Jack. Or better yet, cut it down. It's too big anyway. Cut it down? Jack's stomach twisted when she said that. Cut down his tree? His great-great-grandpa's tree? No way. But he didn't yell or get mad. He just smiled again, a little wider this time. I'll think about it, he said, same as always. Karen glared at him. You'd better do more than think, she said. I'm serious, Jack. Fix it, or I will. Then she turned around and marched off, her shoes clicking all the way back to the street. Jack watched her go, closing the door real slow. He walked back to his window and picked up his lemonade again. He took a sip, staring out at his tree. That's when you could see it if you looked real close. A tiny spark in his eyes. A little twitch at the corner of his mouth. Jack wasn't just a quiet guy who liked trees. He was smart. He was sneaky. And he had something up his sleeve. Karen thought she was the boss, but she didn't know Jack at all. She didn't know what he was planning, or how he'd been waiting for her to push him just a little too far. What was Jack hiding? Was it something about the tree? Something about Karen? Or maybe something nobody in Maple Grove would ever guess? You're probably wondering right now, aren't you? Good, because this story's just getting started. Stick around, friends, because things are about to get wild. Imagine this, Jack wasn't scared of Karen. Not even a little. While she was busy writing rules and bossing people around, Jack was too busy thinking. He'd known for a while that Karen didn't like his tree. She'd been complaining about it ever since he moved in 2 years ago. At first, it was small stuff. "Your leaves are on my lawn," she'd say, even though her house was 3 doors down. Then it got bigger. "That tree's too tall," she'd grumble. "It blocks the view." What view? Jack always wondered. All you could see from her place was more houses. But lately, Karen had gotten louder. Meaner. She'd started leaving notes on his door, little papers with big, angry words. "Trim your tree," they'd say. "HOA rules." Jack kept them all in a drawer, just in case. He didn't know why yet, but he had a feeling they'd come in handy. That's the thing about Jack, he didn't miss much. He noticed everything, even the stuff people thought he didn't see. Like the way Karen smiled when she thought she'd won. That smug grin she wore, like she was better than everybody else. Jack saw it every time she talked to him. He saw it that afternoon, too, as she walked away from his house. She thought he'd give up. She thought he'd grab a saw and start chopping his tree just because she told him to. But Jack wasn't that guy. He wasn't going to let her win, not this time. "Let's talk about that tree again, because it's a big deal. Picture it in your head, a huge, old oak with a trunk so thick it looked like it could hold up the sky. Its branches twisted and turned, reaching out like they wanted to hug the whole neighborhood. In the fall, the leaves turned gold and red, falling all over Jack's yard like a big, colorful blanket. Kids loved playing under it, jumping in the piles. Even the squirrels liked it. They'd scamper up and down, hiding nuts in the bark. Jack's dad used to tell him stories about that tree when he was little. "Your great-great-grandpa planted it with his own hands," he'd say, sitting on the porch with Jack on his knee. "He dug the hole, dropped in the seed, and waited. It grew strong, just like our family." Jack never forgot that. Every time he looked at the tree, he thought about his dad, his grandpa, and all the people who came before him. It wasn't just wood and leaves, it was a memory. Karen didn't care about memories, though. She didn't care about Jack's family or the history in that tree. All she saw was a bunch of leaves she didn't want to sweep up. All she cared about was her rules and her clipboard. That's why she kept coming back, bugging Jack over and over. She wanted that tree gone, and she wasn't going to stop until it happened. But Jack? He wasn't going to let it happen. Not without a fight, a quiet, sneaky fight that Karen wouldn't see coming. That afternoon, after she left, Jack stood by his window a long time. He looked at his tree, watching the leaves sway in the breeze. He thought about Karen's words, "Fix it, or I will." A little laugh slipped out of him, so soft you'd barely hear it. Fix it? Oh, something was going to get fixed, all right. But it wasn't going to be the tree. So, what do you think Jack's hiding? Is he planning something tricky? Something smart? Maybe he's got a secret weapon up his sleeve, or maybe he's just waiting for Karen to make a big mistake. Whatever it is, it's going to be good. Really good. You don't want to miss this, trust me. Keep hanging out with me, because this story's about to take off like a rocket. Karen Baxter wasn't just a little bit annoying. Oh no, she was like a buzzing fly that wouldn't go away. She was relentless, which means she never stopped, not even for a second. Every single week, she'd put on her shiny black shoes, grab her clipboard, and march right up to Jack Riley's house. Her steps were loud, thump, 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 like she wanted everyone to know she was coming. When she got to Jack's front door, she didn't knock all nice and polite. Nope, she'd bang on it hard, like she was the boss of everything. "Jack," she'd yell, her voice sharp and bossy. "Trim that tree. It's against the rules." She'd hold up her HOA handbook, a little book full of neighborhood rules, like it was some kind of super weapon. She'd wave it in the air, pointing at the big oak tree in Jack's front yard. That tree, the one that was 150 years old, was her enemy. She hated it, and she wanted Jack to chop off its branches or maybe even cut the whole thing down. Jack would open the door slow, peeking out at her. He never got mad, though. He didn't yell back or slam the door in her face. Instead, he'd just shrug his shoulders, like it was no big deal. "I'll look into it," he'd say, his voice nice and calm. Then he'd give her a little smile and close the door real quiet. Karen would huff and puff, like a dragon who didn't get her way, and stomp off down the driveway. She thought Jack was scared of her, or maybe just lazy. She thought she was winning. But here's the thing, deep down, Karen's words hurt Jack. Not because he cared what she thought about him. Nope, it was because of that tree. That big, beautiful oak wasn't just some plant to him. It was special. Super special. It was a piece of history, planted by his great-great-grandfather a long, long time ago. Imagine that 150 years. That's older than anybody Jack knew, older than the houses in Maple Grove, older than the street itself. His great-great-grandfather had dug a hole with his own hands, dropped a tiny seed in the dirt, and watched it grow. That tree had been there through rain, snow, wind, and sun. It was like a family member to Jack, and every time Karen told him to cut it, it felt like she was picking on someone he loved. Jack didn't tell Karen that, though. He didn't tell anybody. He kept it inside, locked up tight. But if you looked real close, you could see it in his eyes, a little flicker of sadness when she talked about his tree. He'd stand there, listening to her bark orders, and think about his dad's stories. That oak's tough, his dad used to say. It's been through everything, and it's still standing. Jack wanted it to keep standing forever. It meant everything to him, more than his house, more than his garden, more than anything else in Maple Grove. But Karen didn't care about Jack's feelings. She didn't care about history or family or any of that stuff. All she cared about was her rules. She'd stand on Jack's porch, waving that handbook, reading out loud like she was giving a big speech. Page 12, rule number 5, she'd say, pointing her finger at him. No trees can drop leaves on the sidewalk. It's a safety problem. Jack didn't think a few leaves were a problem. Nobody ever tripped over them. Kids even liked kicking them around in the fall. But Karen acted like those leaves were the worst thing in the world. And it wasn't just Karen who made things hard for Jack. The neighbors didn't help either. Maple Grove was a small place, and people liked to talk. They'd see Karen yelling at Jack, and instead of sticking up for him, they'd whisper behind his back. "Jack's so lazy," they'd say, peeking out their windows. "Why doesn't he just trim that tree?" Or sometimes, "He's weird, fighting over a dumb old tree." They'd shake their heads and roll their eyes, like Jack was the strange one for caring. Take Mr. Harper, for example. He lived across the street with his wife, Mrs. Harper. They were old and liked sitting on their porch all day, drinking tea and watching the neighborhood. Mr. Harper would see Karen at Jack's house and mutter, "That boy's too stubborn. He should listen to the HOA." Mrs. Harper would nod and sip her tea, agreeing with him. Then there was Tommy, the kid with the skateboard. He'd zoom by Jack's yard and shout, "Your tree's cool, but Karen's gonna win." Even Mrs. Lopez, who grew pretty flowers down the street, would sigh and say, "Jack, just cut it a little. Make her happy." Jack heard all of it. He wasn't deaf. He'd be out watering his tree or pulling weeds, and those whispers would float over to him. Lazy. Weird. Stubborn. The word stung a little, like tiny bee stings, but he didn't let it show. He'd keep working in his yard, pretending he didn't hear a thing. Inside, though, it made him sad. Why didn't anybody see how special his tree was? Why were they all on Karen's side? Karen loved that the neighbors talked about Jack. Oh, she loved it a lot. Every time someone said something mean, her smile got bigger. She'd walk past Jack's house with her head held high, like she was the queen of Maple Grove. Sometimes she'd stop right in his yard, cross her arms, and smirk at him. "This is my neighborhood, Jack," she'd say, her voice all proud and loud. "You'll learn that soon enough." She wanted him to feel small, like he didn't belong. She wanted him to give up and do what she said. But Jack didn't argue with her. He didn't yell or fight or tell her to leave him alone. Nope, he stayed quiet. Real quiet. He'd stand there, looking at her with his calm eyes, and just nod a little. "Okay, Karen," he'd say, soft as a whisper. Then he'd turn around and go back inside, or maybe keep watering his tree like she wasn't even there. Karen thought that meant she'd won. She'd strut away. Strut means walking all fancy and proud, her shoes clicking on the pavement, thinking she was the boss of everything. But here's the sneaky part. Jack wasn't quiet because he was scared or weak. Oh no. He was quiet because he was smart. While Karen was busy bossing him around, Jack was watching her. Watching real close. Every time she came to his house, every time she waved that handbook or smirked at him, he noticed. He saw the way her eyes gleamed when she thought she was winning. He heard the way she said "my neighborhood" like it was hers and hers alone. He paid attention to every single thing she did. And sometimes, only sometimes, if you looked at Jack's face real careful, you'd see something. A little hint of a smile. Not a big, happy grin, but a tiny one, creeping up at the corners of his mouth. It was so small you might miss it if you blinked. But it was there. What was he smiling about? What was he up to? Karen didn't see it. She was too busy strutting around, too busy thinking she had Jack all figured out. She didn't have a clue that something was going on behind his quiet face. Let's think about Karen for a minute, because she's a big part of this. Karen Baxter wasn't new to Maple Grove. She'd lived there for 10 whole years, longer than Jack. When she moved in, she joined the HOA right away, the club that makes neighborhood rules. At first, she was just a regular member, going to meetings and nodding along. But then, 3 years ago, she decided she wanted to be the president. She ran for the job, telling everybody she'd make Maple Grove perfect. People voted for her because she seemed so sure of herself, with her clipboard and her big ideas. Once she was president, though, things changed. Karen didn't just want to make rules, she wanted to control everything. She'd walk around with that handbook, checking every house like a detective. If your grass grew too tall, she'd leave a note. If your mailbox wasn't shiny enough, she'd knock on your door. She even told Tommy he couldn't ride his skateboard too fast. Everybody started calling her HOA Karen behind her back, because she was always telling people what to do. Jack moved in 2 years ago, and that's when the trouble really started. The first time Karen saw his oak tree, her nose wrinkled up like she'd smelled something bad. Too messy, she said, standing in his yard with her hands on her hips. Jack was nice about it back then. It's been here forever, he told her, hoping she'd understand. But Karen didn't care. She just kept coming back, week after week, saying the same things. Trim it. Cut it. It's against the rules. At first, Jack thought she'd give up. Some people complain a lot but then get bored and stop. Not Karen. She was like a dog with a bone she wouldn't let go. Every Monday, like clockwork, she'd show up at his door. Jack, that tree's a problem, she'd say. Do something about it. And every Monday, Jack would shrug and say, I'll look into it. It was like a game they played, but Karen didn't know Jack wasn't really playing. The neighbors made it worse, like I said. They didn't stick up for Jack, they just watched and whispered. Mr. Harper would sit on his porch, sipping tea, and say, Karen's right, you know. That tree's too big. Tommy would laugh and tell his friends, Jack's gonna lose this one. Even Mrs. Lopez, who was usually nice, would shake her head and say, Jack, why fight her? She always wins. It felt like the whole neighborhood was against him, like they'd picked Karen's side without even asking him why the tree mattered. But Jack didn't let it get him down. He didn't cry or complain or give up. He just kept doing his thing, watering his tree, pulling weeds, living his quiet life. And all the while, he watched Karen. He listened to her loud voice and her mean words. He saw the way she bossed everybody around, thinking she was the queen. And that little smile. It kept showing up, just for a second, before he'd hide it again. What was Jack thinking? Why didn't he fight back? Most people would have yelled at Karen by now, or maybe gone to the HOA and told them she was being mean. But Jack didn't do that. He stayed calm, like a lake with no ripples. Was he scared? Was he tired? Or was he planning something big that Karen didn't see coming? She was too busy barking orders and waving her handbook to notice anything. Too busy thinking she'd already won. Let's picture it, Karen standing in Jack's yard, her clipboard in one hand, her other hand pointing at the tree. This is my neighborhood, she'd say, her voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. Jack would stand on his porch, hands in his pockets, looking at her with those calm eyes. The neighbors would peek out their windows, whispering and waiting to see what happened. And that oak tree, big and strong and old, would just sit there, its leaves rustling in the wind, like it knew something nobody else did. Karen thought she had Jack beat. She thought he was just a quiet guy who'd give in eventually. But she didn't know him at all. She didn't know what was going on in his head, or why he smiled when she turned her back. She didn't know that every time she came to his house, every time she snapped at him, she was walking closer to something big. Something that would change everything. So what do you think? Was Jack just being nice, or was he hiding something sneaky? Was he going to let Karen win, or was he waiting for the perfect moment to surprise her? Stick with me, because this story's getting good, and you don't want to miss what happens next. Weeks went by after Karen started bossing Jack around about his tree. Not just a few days, nope, whole weeks. The sun came up and went down, the leaves on Jack's big oak tree turned a little more golden, and Karen? She didn't stop. She didn't get tired or bored like most people would. Instead, she got bolder. That means she got pushier, louder, and even meaner. She wasn't just asking Jack to trim his tree anymore. Oh no, she was ready to take it down herself. One day, Jack came home from the store. He'd been out buying some milk and bread, nothing big. His little yellow house looked the same as always, with that giant oak tree standing tall in the front yard. But when he got to his door, something was different. There was a piece of paper taped right on it, flapping a little in the breeze. Jack tilted his head and pulled it off. He read the word slow, and his tummy felt funny like when you drop down fast on a roller coaster. The paper said, "Tree scheduled for removal, HOA orders." Removal. That meant they were going to cut it down. Jack's heart sank. It felt heavy, like a big rock was sitting in his chest. His oak tree, the one his great-great-grandpa planted, the one that had been there for 150 years, was in trouble. The notice said it was happening tomorrow. Tomorrow. Jack's hands shook a little as he held the paper. He couldn't believe it. Karen had gone too far this time. He ran inside and grabbed his phone. He had to call the HOA, the neighborhood rule club, and find out what was going on. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he could stop it. He dialed the number fast, his fingers fumbling over the buttons. The phone rang once, twice, then someone picked up. "Maple Grove HOA," a voice said. But it wasn't just any voice, it was Karen's. Her sharp, bossy tone cut through the line like a knife slicing through bread. "Karen," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's this notice about? You can't cut my tree." Karen laughed a short, mean laugh. "Oh, it's done, Jack," she said. "Tomorrow, that eyesore comes down. It's been a problem too long, and I'm fixing it." Her words were hard, like she'd already won. Before Jack could say anything back, before he could even ask why or how, she hung up. Click. The line went dead, and Jack just stood there, holding the phone, staring at it like it might talk to him. He put the phone down slow and looked out his window. The oak tree was still there, big and strong, its branches waving a little in the wind. But now Jack knew tomorrow, it wouldn't be. Karen was coming for it, and she wasn't playing around anymore. Jack's heart hurt. He didn't know what to do. Should he run outside and hug the tree? Should he call someone else? He just sat on his couch, the notice crumpled in his hand, thinking about his great-great-grandpa and all the years that tree had stood there. The next morning came too fast. The sun peeked over the houses, and Jack woke up to a loud noise. Vroom, vroom. He jumped out of bed and ran to his window. Outside, a big truck was parked in front of his house. It wasn't a normal truck, it had ladders and tools strapped to it. Then he saw them, a crew of workers in orange vests, unloading chainsaws. Chainsaws. Those are the loud machines that cut through wood like it's butter. Jack's eyes got wide. This was real. They were here for his tree. He pulled on his shoes and ran outside, still in his pajamas. The air was cool, and the grass was wet with dew under his feet. He stood on his porch, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, watching. The workers didn't look at him, they just got to work. One guy started up a chainsaw buzz, and the sound made Jack's tummy twist. Another guy climbed a ladder, leaning close to the oak's branches. Then they started cutting. Big chunks of wood fell to the ground, thud, thud, thud. Leaves fluttered down like green snow. Jack didn't move. He just stood there, watching them hack away at his beloved oak. That's a fancy word, beloved, but it just means he loved it a lot. Every slice of the chainsaw felt like a poke at his heart. He could see the trunk getting smaller, the branches disappearing one by one. His tree, the one that shaded his yard, the one kids played under, the one his family had cared for, was going away, and he couldn't stop it. The neighbors noticed too. Across the street, Mr. and Mrs. Harper sat on their porch like always, sipping their morning tea. Mrs. Harper peeked over her cup, her eyes big. Mr. Harper shook his head slow, muttering something Jack couldn't hear. Down the road, Tommy rolled by on his skateboard, stopping to watch. He giggled a little, like it was funny, then zoomed off. Mrs. Lopez popped her head out her door, her mouth open in a little O shape. Some people watched from their windows, curtains pulled back just enough to see. A few of them shook their heads, like they felt bad. Others smirked, like they thought Jack deserved it. And then there was Karen. Oh, Karen was there, all right. She stood right in Jack's yard, arms crossed over her chest, watching the whole thing. She didn't have her clipboard this time, she didn't need it. Her big sunglasses sat on her nose, and her lips were curled into a proud smile. She looked like she'd just won a prize at the fair. Every time a branch fell crash, her smile got bigger. She nodded to the workers, like she was their boss, telling them, "Good job," without even saying it. Jack watched her too. He didn't say a word. He didn't yell at the workers or run over to Karen and shake his fists. Nope, he just stood there on his porch, hands in his pockets, quiet as a mouse. The chainsaws buzzed, the tree shrank, and Karen grinned, but Jack didn't move. His face was calm, like a still pond with no waves. But if you looked real close, really close, you'd see something. His eyes. They weren't sad or mad like you'd expect. They were glinting. That means they had a little sparkle, a tiny light, like he knew something nobody else did. The workers kept going. By noon, the tree was almost gone. The big, wide trunk that used to take 3 kids to hug was now just a short, flat stump sticking out of the ground. The branches were piled up in a messy heap on Jack's lawn, leaves scattered everywhere. The yard looked empty without that giant oak, like a puzzle missing its biggest piece. The shade was gone, the squirrels had nowhere to climb, and Jack's porch felt hot under the bright sun. Karen clapped her hands together, clap, clap, and turned to the workers. "Much better," she said, loud enough for Jack to hear. "This place looks clean now. No more mess." She sounded so happy, like she'd fixed the whole world. The workers nodded, packed up their chainsaws, and drove off in their truck. Karen dusted off her hands, like she'd done the work herself, and gave Jack one last look. Her smirk said it all: "I win, you lose." Then she turned and walked away, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk, click, click, click. Jack stayed on his porch a little longer. The neighbors went back inside, closing their curtains. The street got quiet again, except for a few birds chirping. Jack looked at the stump where his tree used to be. He tilted his head, like he was thinking hard. Then he turned to go inside, but not before something happened. Something small, something sneaky. As he walked away, he muttered something under his breath. It was so soft, so quiet, you'd have to be right next to him to hear it. Did he say lawsuit? Wait, what's that? A lawsuit is when you take someone to court because they did something wrong. Did Jack really say that? Nah, couldn't be. Or, could it? Let's back up a bit, because this is getting good. Those weeks before the tree got cut were wild. Karen didn't just wake up one day and decide to take it down. Nope, she'd been planning it, step by step. After all those Mondays yelling at Jack, she started doing more. She'd walk around his yard with a tape measure, measuring the branches like a scientist. She'd take pictures with her phone, snap, snap, grumbling about the leaves. She even talked to the neighbors, telling them, "Jack's tree is a problem. We're getting rid of it soon." Mr. Harper nodded, Tommy laughed, and Mrs. Lopez just shrugged. Jack saw all of it. He'd be in his garden, pulling weeds, and catch her out of the corner of his eye. He didn't say anything, though. He just kept working, quiet as ever. But he noticed. Oh, he noticed everything. The way Karen's voice got louder each time she came by. The way she started leaving notes on his door more than usual. Last warning, they'd say, written in big, angry letters. Jack kept those notes too, stacking them in a drawer with the first one. Why? Nobody knew. Not yet. Then came the day before the notice. Karen showed up late, right as the sun was setting. Jack was inside, eating dinner, mac and cheese, his favorite, when he heard her shoes on his porch. Thump, thump. He opened the door, fork still in his hand, and there she was. No clipboard this time, just her standing there, arms crossed. "Jack," she said, her voice low and serious. I'm done asking. That tree's going tomorrow. I've got the HOA behind me. You can't stop it? Jack blinked at her. Tomorrow, he asked, like he didn't believe it. Tomorrow, she said, nodding hard. It's over, Jack. Say goodbye to your mess. Then she turned and left, disappearing into the dark. Jack closed the door slow, his mac and cheese getting cold on the table. He didn't eat any more that night. He just sat there, thinking, his hands folded in his lap. So when that notice showed up the next day, it wasn't a total surprise. Jack knew Karen was serious, he'd seen it coming. But it still hurt. And when he called her, when she laughed and hung up, it hurt more. That's why, the next morning, he didn't fight the workers. He didn't run out and yell or try to climb the tree to save it. He just watched. Watched them cut it down, watched Karen smile, watched his yard turn empty. But that glint in his eyes? That little sparkle? It was there the whole time. Even as the chainsaws buzzed, even as Karen clapped, Jack wasn't broken. He wasn't giving up. He was, waiting. Waiting for what? And that word he muttered, lawsuit, was it real? Did he mean it? Karen didn't hear it. She was too busy celebrating. The neighbors didn't hear it, they were too busy watching. But Jack said it, soft and sneaky, like a secret just for him. What was he up to? Was he mad enough to fight back now? Was he planning something big, something that would turn Karen's win into a lose? Picture it, the tree gone, the stump sitting there, Karen walking away all proud. And Jack, standing on his porch, hands in his pockets, with that tiny, tiny smile creeping back. He didn't look sad anymore. He looked ready. This is where it gets fun, friends. The tree's down, Karen thinks she's the champ, but Jack's got something cooking. What do you think it is? Is he going to cry about his tree, or is he going to surprise everybody? Stick around, because the next part's going to be wild. A few days passed after Karen had Jack's big oak tree cut down. The neighborhood was quiet again, almost too quiet. The stump sat in Jack's yard like a sad little reminder of what used to be there. Karen strutted around Maple Grove like she owned the whole place, her nose in the air and that smug smile stuck on her face. She thought she'd won. She thought Jack was done fighting. She thought everything was perfect now, with no more messy tree to bug her. But oh boy, was she wrong. One sunny afternoon, Karen was at home, sitting in her fancy living room. She had a cup of tea in her hand, and she was flipping through her HOA handbook, probably looking for more rules to boss people around with. The doorbell rang ding-dong, and she put her tea down, frowning. "Who's that?" she muttered to herself. She wasn't expecting anybody. She got up, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the door, ready to tell whoever it was to go away. When she opened the door, there stood a man she didn't know. He was tall, with a serious face, and he wore a dark suit that looked all stiff and important. In his hand, he held a thick envelope, the kind grown UPS use for big papers. Karen tilted her head, confused. "Yes," she said, her voice sharp like always. "What do you want?" The man looked at her and said, "Are you Karen Baxter?" His voice was deep and calm, like he wasn't scared of her at all. Karen nodded, still frowning. "Yeah, that's me." "Who are you?" The man didn't smile. He just held out the envelope and said, "You've been served." Then he turned around and walked away, leaving Karen standing there with the papers in her hands. She blinked fast, like she couldn't believe it. Served? What did that mean? She ripped open the envelope, her fingers shaking a little, and pulled out a big stack of papers. She started reading, and her face, oh, her face, it went white. Like, ghost white. All the color drained out, and her eyes got wide as she saw the words at the top, lawsuit $50,000 in damages. A lawsuit? That's when you take someone to court because they did something bad. And $50,000. That's a lot of money, like, enough to buy a car or a whole bunch of video games. Karen's hands shook harder now. She read more, and the papers said it was about the oak tree. Jack's oak tree. The one she'd had cut down. She didn't understand. How could a tree get her in trouble? She dropped the papers on her doorstep and stood there, breathing fast, her brain spinning like a top. Meanwhile, back at Jack's little yellow house, Something big was happening. Jack wasn't just sitting around feeling sad about his tree. Nope, he was busy. The truth, the real, secret truth was coming out, and it was wild. See, that oak tree wasn't just old and pretty. It was protected. That means it had special rules saying nobody could hurt it. Jack had known this for a long time, way before Karen got the chainsaws out. Months ago, way back when she first started complaining about the leaves, Jack had done something sneaky. He'd gone to the library one day, all quiet-like, with his hands in his pockets. He sat down at a big table and started reading books about trees and history. He found out that really old trees, like his oak, could be called historic landmarks. That's a fancy way of saying they're super important, like a museum or a statue. If a tree's a landmark, nobody's allowed to cut it down, not even the HOA. Jack smiled to himself that day in the library. He had an idea. So, he got to work. He filled out some papers, boring grown-up stuff, and sent them to a special office in town. He told them all about his tree, how old it was, who planted it, and why it mattered. He even added a picture of his great-great-grandpa, standing next to the tiny oak when it was just a baby tree. A few weeks later, he got a letter back. It said, "Congratulations, Jack Riley. Your oak tree is now a historic landmark." That meant it was safe, or so he thought. Jack didn't tell anybody about this. Not the neighbors, not Karen, not even his best friend. He kept it a secret, locked up tight in his head. Why? Because he knew Karen wouldn't stop. He knew she'd keep pushing and pushing until she crossed a line. And when she did, he'd be ready. He wasn't just some quiet gardener who liked plants. Oh no, Jack was smart. Sneaky smart. He'd been working with a lawyer, a grown-up who helps people with court stuff, for weeks. Together, they gathered proof, the landmark papers, Karen's angry notes, pictures of the tree before it got cut. They had a big plan, and they were waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when Karen had the tree chopped down. Jack watched it happen, standing on his porch with his hands in his pockets. He didn't yell or cry because he didn't need to. He knew what was coming next. The day after the tree was gone, he called his lawyer. "She did it," he said, his voice calm. "Let's go." The lawyer grinned on the other end of the phone and said, "Time to serve her." That's when they sent the man in the suit to Karen's house with those papers. Back to Karen, she couldn't stay still after reading that lawsuit. She grabbed the papers off her doorstep, her face still white, and stormed out of her house. She didn't even lock her door, she was too mad. Her shoes clicked fast on the sidewalk, click, 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 as she marched straight to Jack's place. She was like a hurricane, all wild and loud, ready to blow everything down. When she got to his yard, she saw the stump where the tree used to be, and it made her even madder. She banged on Jack's door, bam, 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 holding the lawsuit papers up like a weapon. Jack opened the door slow, peeking out at her. He didn't look scared or surprised. He just leaned against the door frame, one hand in his pocket, calm as ever. Karen's face was red now, not white anymore, and her eyes were blazing. "What is this?" she screamed, waving the papers so hard they flapped like bird wings. "A lawsuit? $50,000. Are you crazy, Jack?" Jack didn't yell back. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at her with those quiet eyes and said, "You wanted my tree gone, Karen. Now you're paying for it, literally." His words were soft, but they hit her like a big smack. Literally means for real, and Jack meant it. Karen was going to pay money, lots of money, because of what she did. Karen's jaw dropped. That's when your mouth falls open because you're so shocked you can't talk. For once, for the first time ever, she had nothing to say. Her lips moved a little, like she wanted to yell, but no words came out. She just stood there, staring at Jack, the papers shaking in her hands. The neighbors heard her screaming and peeked out their windows. Mr. and Mrs. Harper stopped sipping their tea. Tommy rolled up on his skateboard, eyes wide. Mrs. Lopez stepped onto her porch, gasping loud. They all heard it, they all knew something huge was happening. Jack didn't stop there. He stepped out onto his porch, still calm, and looked at Karen. "That tree was a historic landmark," he said, slow and clear. "I got it protected months ago. You didn't check, did you? Cutting it down wasn't just mean, it was illegal. Illegal means against the law, and Karen had broken it big time. Jack kept going. I told my lawyer everything. We've got proof, your notes, the HOA orders, all of it. You can't boss your way out of this one. Karen blinked fast, like her brain was trying to catch up. A landmark, she squeaked, her voice all high and shaky. Protected? But I didn't know. She sounded like a kid who got caught sneaking cookies, trying to wiggle out of trouble. But it was too late. Jack had her cornered. You didn't ask, Jack said, shrugging a little. You just did it? Now you've got to fix it? He pointed at the papers in her hand. That's what the lawsuit's for. $50,000 for the tree, and for breaking the law. See you in court, Karen. Then he gave her a tiny smile, not a mean one, just a quiet one, and stepped back inside, closing the door soft as a whisper. Karen stood there, frozen. The neighbors gasped again, louder this time. Mr. Harper dropped his teacup clink, and it rolled off the porch. Tommy whispered, "Whoa," and Mrs. Lopez covered her mouth with her hand. They couldn't believe it. Jack, quiet little Jack, had turned the tables on Karen. She thought she'd won when the tree came down, but now she was the one in big trouble. Let's picture it, Karen on Jack's porch, her face red and her mouth open, holding those papers like they were burning her hands. Jack leaning against his door, cool as a cucumber, telling her the truth she never saw coming. The stump in the yard, just sitting there, like it was laughing at her too. And all around, the neighbors watching, their eyes popping out of their heads. This was the moment, the big reveal, when everything flipped upside down. Karen didn't move for a long time. She just stood there, staring at Jack's closed door. Her brain was buzzing, trying to figure out what just happened. She'd been so sure she was the boss. She'd been so happy chopping down that tree. But now she was the one who'd lost. Jack wasn't just some guy she could push around. He'd been ready for her all along, waiting with his secret plan. Back inside, Jack sat on his couch, looking out his window at the stump. He didn't jump up and down or cheer. He just sat there, quiet like always, with that tiny smile still on his face. He'd known this day would come. Ever since Karen started bugging him, ever since she waved that handbook in his face, he'd been preparing. He didn't need to yell or fight, he just needed to wait. And now, the waiting was over. Karen finally turned and walked away, her shoes clicking slower this time. Click, click, click. She didn't look proud anymore. She looked small, like a balloon that lost all its air. The papers hung limp in her hand as she shuffled back to her house. The neighbors kept watching, whispering to each other. Did you hear that? Mrs. Harper said to her husband. A lawsuit? Tommy grinned and said, Jack's awesome. Mrs. Lopez shook her head, muttering, poor Karen. She didn't know. But Jack knew. He'd known all along. That oak tree wasn't just a tree, it was his weapon. Not a sword or a gun, but something even better, a secret. He'd protected it quiet like, with papers and a lawyer, and let Karen walk right into his trap. When she cut it down, she didn't just take his tree, she gave him everything he needed to win. So what do you think? Wasn't that wild? Karen thought she was the queen, but Jack was the real champ. He didn't need to be loud or mean, he just used his brain and waited for the perfect moment. Now Karen's got a big problem, and Jack's the hero nobody saw coming. Stick around, because there's more to the story, and it's going to get even better. After that big showdown on Jack's porch, things didn't stay quiet for long. The lawsuit, the one that made Karen's face go white and her jaw drop, was a game changer. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was real, and it hit Karen hard. Really hard. A few weeks later, Jack and Karen had to go to court. That's where grown ups in big robes, call judges, decide who's right and who's wrong. Jack brought his lawyer, the one he'd been working with all along, and Karen showed up too, looking nervous instead of bossy for once. The courtroom was a big room with tall ceilings and wooden benches. Jack sat on one side, calm as ever, his hands folded in his lap. Karen sat on the other side, fidgeting with her purse and glancing around like she wanted to run away. The judge sat up high, looking down at them, and listened to the whole story. Jack's lawyer stood up and talked first. He had a loud, clear voice that filled the room. Jack's oak tree was a historic landmark, he said. It was protected by law, and Karen Baxter cut it down anyway. She broke the rules, big rules, and now she has to pay. The lawyer showed the judge all the proof, the papers that said the tree was a landmark, the angry notes Karen left on Jack's door, even pictures of the tree before it got chopped. The judge nodded slow, his face serious, flipping through the papers. Then it was Karen's turn. She didn't have a fancy lawyer, just herself. She stood up, her voice all shaky, and said, "I didn't know it was protected. It was messy. I was just trying to make the neighborhood nice." But the judge didn't buy it. He shook his head and said, "You should have checked, Ms. Baxter. You can't just cut down someone's tree because you don't like it, especially not a landmark." Then he banged a little hammer, bang, and made his decision. "The court rules in favor of Jack Riley," he said. "Karen Baxter, you have to pay $50,000 for the tree's value and fines for breaking the law." $50,000. That's a huge pile of money, like a mountain of dollar bills. Karen's eyes got wide, and she sat down fast, like her legs stopped working. Jack didn't cheer or jump up. He just gave a little nod, like he knew this was coming. The judge's words meant justice was served. Karen had messed up, and now she had to fix it with her wallet. The courtroom got quiet, and then everybody left, Jack with a tiny smile, Karen with her head hanging low. But that wasn't the only thing that happened to Karen. Oh no, there was more. The HOA, the neighborhood rule club, heard about the lawsuit and got mad. Really mad. Karen had been their president, the big boss, but she'd gone too far this time. Cutting down a protected tree? Breaking the law. That wasn't okay. They had a big meeting at Mrs. Lopez's house one night, with all the neighbors sitting around her living room, drinking lemonade and talking loud. Mr. Harper stood up first, his teacup still in his hand. "Karen's out of control," he said. "She can't be president anymore." Mrs. Harper nodded fast, agreeing with him. Tommy's mom was there too. She didn't usually come to meetings, but this was big. "She made us look bad," she said. "The HOA is supposed to help, not hurt people." Even Mrs. Lopez, who was usually quiet, spoke up. "Jack lost his tree because of her. We need a new leader." So they voted. One by one, they raised their hands to say, "Karen's out." It was faster than Karen cutting down that tree. By the end of the night, the HOA fired her as president. She wasn't the boss anymore. No more clipboard, no more rules, no more strutting around like a queen. Karen was done, and everybody knew it. They picked Mrs. Lopez to be the new president instead, because she was nice and fair. The neighbors cheered, happy to have someone new in charge. Back at Jack's house, things were looking up. That $50,000 from Karen didn't just sit in his pocket. Nope, Jack had a plan for it. A few days after the court day, he went to the garden store. It was a sunny Saturday, and the store was full of flowers and plants and little trees in pots. Jack walked up and down the rows, hands in his pockets, looking at everything. Then he saw it, a sturdy little oak tree, not too big yet, but strong and healthy. Its leaves were bright green, and its trunk was straight. It wasn't 150 years old like his old one, but it was perfect. He bought it right away, smiling at the cashier as he paid with some of that lawsuit money. Then he brought it home in his truck, the little tree bouncing in the back. When he got to his yard, he grabbed a shovel and started digging right where the old stump was. The neighbors saw him. Mr. Harper peeked over his fence, Mrs. Lopez waved from her porch, and Tommy rolled by on his skateboard, stopping to watch. Jack didn't mind. He just kept digging, making a nice hole in the dirt. When the hole was deep enough, he plopped the new oak tree in and covered its roots with soil. He patted the ground soft, like tucking it into bed, and then stood back to look. It wasn't the same as his old tree, not yet. It didn't have big branches or lots of shade. But it was a start. A fresh, green start. Jack smiled at it, a real smile this time, not just a sneaky one. "Grow big," he whispered to it, like it could hear him. The neighbors stopped whispering about Jack after that. All those mean words, lazy, weird, stubborn, they went away. Poof. Gone like magic. Instead, people started seeing him different. Mr. and Mrs. Harper came over one day, knocking on his door all shy. "Jack," Mr. Harper said, holding his hat in his hands, "we're sorry we didn't help you with Karen." "That was wrong." Mrs. Harper nodded and added, Can we water your new tree sometimes? To make up for it? Jack just smiled and said, sure, thanks. He wasn't mad, he was too nice for that. Tommy showed up too, kicking his skateboard to a stop. Hey, Jack, he said, grinning big. Your tree's cool. Sorry I laughed when it got cut. Want me to help dig weeds or something? Jack chuckled and handed him a little shovel. Go for it, he said, and Tommy got to work, happy to be part of it. Even Mrs. Lopez stopped by with a watering can. I should have said something to Karen, she admitted, pouring water around the new tree. You're a good guy, Jack. Jack thanked her too, and pretty soon, his yard was full of helpers. Karen, though. She was a different story. After the lawsuit and getting fired, she didn't strut around anymore. She kept her head down, like she was afraid to look at anybody. She stopped walking past Jack's street, she'd take the long way around, even if it meant extra steps. It was like she wanted to hide. The neighbors called it avoiding like the plague, which means staying far, far away. Karen's big sunglasses stayed in her house, her clipboard stayed on her table, and her bossy voice stayed quiet. The queen of the neighborhood had fallen, flat on her face, and she knew it. Jack didn't rub it in. He didn't go to her house and say, "Ha, I won." That wasn't his style. He just kept living his quiet life, tending to his new tree and watering his garden. But everybody could see it, Jack had won. Not with yelling or fighting, but with his sneaky smart plan. The guy everyone underestimated, the quiet one who never made a fuss, turned out to be the strongest of all. Let's picture it, Jack in his yard, the little oak tree growing bit by bit. The sun shines down, the leaves wiggle in the breeze, and the neighbors wave as they walk by. Across the street, Mr. and Mrs. Harper sip their tea and smile at him. Tommy zooms around, helping out when he's not skating. Mrs. Lopez waters her flowers and checks on Jack's tree too. And Karen? She's nowhere in sight, hiding in her house, her crown long gone. Weeks turned into months, and that new oak kept growing. It got a little taller, a little wider, spreading its branches like it wanted to hug the yard. Jack would sit on his porch sometimes, just watching it, thinking about his old tree and his great-great-grandpa. It wasn't the same, sure, but it felt good. Like a new chapter in a book, one where he got to write the ending. The neighborhood changed too. With Mrs. Lopez as HOA president, things got nicer. No more mean notes or silly rules. She'd ask people what they wanted, not tell them what to do. Let's make Maple Grove happy, she'd say at meetings, and everybody clapped. Jack went to one of those meetings once, just to see, and they all thanked him for standing up to Karen. You made us better, Mr. Harper said, and Jack just nodded, a little shy. Karen had to pay that $50,000, bit by bit. It took a long time, she didn't have it all at once. Some say she sold her fancy car to help pay it. Others say she got a job at the grocery store, ringing up cans and bags quietly. Nobody really knew, because she didn't talk much anymore. But every time Jack got a check in the mail from her, he'd put it in the bank and use a little to buy stuff for his garden: new plants, better soil, a shiny watering can. One day, a year later, Jack was out planting flowers around his new tree. It was taller now, almost up to his shoulders, with thick green leaves. Tommy ran over, sweaty from skating. "Jack, your tree's awesome," he said. "It's gonna be big like the old one someday." Jack laughed and said, "Maybe. Takes time." Mrs. Lopez walked by too, smiling big. "You did good, Jack," she said. "This place feels like home again." And it did. Maple Grove wasn't just a bunch of houses anymore, it was a real neighborhood, where people helped each other. Jack's win wasn't just about the money or the tree. It was about showing everybody that being quiet didn't mean being weak. He'd stood up for what mattered, and he'd made things right. So there it was, justice served, plain and simple. Karen lost her power, her money, and her crown. Jack got his payback, his new tree, and his peace. The neighbors learned a lesson, and Maple Grove grew a little greener. The quiet guy everyone underestimated? He turned out to be the hero, and nobody would forget it. What a story, huh? Jack's little oak is growing, Karen's keeping quiet, and everybody's happy, well, almost everybody. It's the kind of ending that makes you feel good inside, like eating your favorite dessert. Stick around, friends, because there's always more to tell. So there it was, justice served, plain and simple. Karen lost her power, her money, and her crown. Jack got his payback, his new tree, and his peace. The neighbors learned a lesson, and Maple Grove grew a little greener. The quiet guy everyone underestimated? He turned out to be the hero, and nobody would forget it. But the story didn't just stop there. Oh no, life kept moving in Maple Grove, and things got even better. That little oak Jack planted with the lawsuit money? It didn't stay little for long. Every day, Jack would go out with his watering can, pouring water around its roots. He'd pat the dirt soft and talk to it, like it was his buddy. "Keep growing," he'd say, smiling at the tiny branches. And it listened. Week by week, it stretched up higher, its leaves getting bigger and greener. It wasn't as tall as the old tree yet, no way, but it was tough, just like Jack. The neighbors loved watching it grow too. Mr. and Mrs. Harper started a new habit. Every morning, they'd sit on their porch with their tea and look across the street at Jack's yard. "That tree's coming along nice," Mr. Harper would say, sipping slow. Mrs. Harper would nod and add, "It's like a little piece of the old one, coming back." They'd wave at Jack when he came out, and he'd wave back, friendly as ever. It felt good, like they were all part of something special. Tommy, the skateboard kid, turned into Jack's biggest helper. He'd zip over after school, his board tucked under his arm, and grab a little rake. "Hey, Jack," he'd yell, grinning big. "Need me to clean up leaves?" Even though the new tree was small and didn't drop much, Tommy liked helping anyway. Jack would laugh and say, "Sure, go ahead," and they'd work together, raking and chatting. Tommy started calling it Jack's Tree, Part 2, like it was a sequel to a movie. "Part 1 was awesome, but Part 2's gonna be epic," he'd say, and Jack would just shake his head, smiling. Mrs. Lopez, the new HOA president, kept the good vibes going. She'd walk by Jack's house every few days, her watering can swinging in her hand. "Looking strong, Jack," she'd call out, pouring a little water on the tree's roots. She'd stay and talk sometimes, telling him about the new HOA plans. "No more silly rules," she said one day, sitting on his porch steps. "We're planting flowers by the mailboxes and fixing the playground. What do you think?" Jack liked that. "Sounds perfect," he'd say, and she'd smile, happy to have his vote. The whole neighborhood started feeling different, like a big family instead of just a bunch of houses. People didn't hide behind their curtains anymore. They'd come out, say hi, and help each other. One Saturday, Mr. Harper brought over a bag of cookies his wife baked, chocolate chip, Jack's favorite. "For you," he said, handing them over. "Thanks for making us see things clear." Jack took the cookies and shared them with Tommy, who just showed up to rake. They sat on the porch, munching away, watching the new tree sway in the wind. Karen, though she was like a ghost now. Nobody saw her much. Her house stayed quiet, the curtains always closed. Sometimes you'd catch her sneaking out to get her mail, her head down low, her big sunglasses gone. She didn't talk to anybody, not even a hello. One time, Tommy saw her walking the long way around the block, avoiding Jack's street. "She's scared of you, Jack," he said, laughing. Jack just shrugged. "I don't care what she does," he said. "Long as she leaves my tree alone." And that $50,000. Karen had to pay it, little by little. She didn't have it all at once, it was too much. Word got around that she sold her shiny red car, the one she used to drive so proud. Now she walked everywhere, or sometimes rode an old bike with a squeaky wheel. Mrs. Lopez saw her at the grocery store once, working the cash register, scanning cans and bags real quiet. "She's keeping to herself," Mrs. Lopez told Jack later. "Guess she learned her lesson." Jack didn't spend all that money on fancy stuff. Nope, he was too simple for that. Most of it went to the new oak tree and his garden. He bought bags of rich dirt, a new shovel with a red handle, and some pretty flowers to plant around the tree, yellow ones that looked like tiny suns. Every time a check came from Karen, he'd put it in the bank, then use a little to make his yard better. "It's not about the money," he told Tommy one day. "It's about growing something good." Months turned into a whole year, and that little oak wasn't so little anymore. It grew up to Jack's chest, its branches spreading out wide enough to give a bit of shade. On hot days, Jack would sit under it with a glass of lemonade, just like he used to with the old tree. It felt right, like the past and the present were hugging each other. The stump from the old oak was still there, but Jack didn't mind. He'd planted grass around it, turning it into a little table for his lemonade cup. The neighbors threw a party one summer day, right in Jack's yard. Mrs. Lopez planned it, calling it the new tree party. Everybody came: Mr. and Mrs. Harper with more cookies, Tommy with his skateboard, even some kids from down the street. They brought food: hot dogs, chips, watermelon, and set up tables under Jack's tree. The shade wasn't big yet, but it was enough. Jack grilled the hot dogs, flipping them with a big smile, while Tommy ran around chasing the little kids. Mrs. Lopez stood up on a chair and clapped her hands. "Listen up," she said, her voice happy. "This party's for Jack and his tree. He showed us what's important: standing up for what you love. Let's cheer for him." Everybody clapped and hooped. Clap, clap, yay. Jack's face turned a little red, but he waved and said, "Thanks, everybody. Means a lot." Then they ate and laughed, the sun setting slow behind the new oak. Karen didn't come to the party, of course. She stayed in her house, probably hearing the noise through her windows. Nobody invited her, not because they were mean, but because she'd made it clear she didn't want to be part of things anymore. "Her loss," Tommy said, munching a hot dog. Jack just nodded, not saying much. He didn't need to. His tree and his friends said it all. Time kept going, and the oak kept growing. By the next spring, it was taller than Jack, its leaves thick and green. Birds started nesting in it, little sparrows that chirped every morning. Squirrels came back too, scampering up the trunk like they used to with the old tree. Jack would watch them from his porch, sipping coffee, feeling happy inside. "You're getting there," he'd say to the tree, patting its bark. The neighbors kept helping, turning Jack's yard into a team project. Mr. Harper brought over a birdhouse one day, painted blue. "For your tree," he said, and Jack hung it on a branch. Mrs. Lopez planted more flowers, red ones this time, around the base. Tommy even made a sign with his crayons that said Jack's tree and stuck it in the dirt. It was wobbly and spelled funny, but Jack loved it. "Best sign ever," he told Tommy, ruffling his hair. Karen's payments kept coming, slow but steady. Jack didn't talk about them much, just put them in the bank and kept his yard growing. Some folks said she moved away after a while, renting her house to a nice family with 2 kids. Others said she stayed, just hiding better. Either way, she was gone from Jack's life, and that was fine by him. One quiet evening, Jack sat under his tree as the sun went down. It was big enough now to shade half his porch, its leaves rustling soft in the breeze. He looked at it, thinking about his great-great-grandpa and the old oak. "You're not the same," he said out loud, "but you're mine." Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the birds. Maple Grove was peaceful again, better than ever, really, and Jack was right in the middle of it, the quiet hero who'd won. And that's how it ended, with a new tree growing strong, neighbors being friends, and Karen out of the picture. Justice wasn't just the money or the court, it was the way everything turned out good. Jack's win made Maple Grove a happier place, and that little oak. It was proof that even after something gets taken away, you can grow something new. Something even better. So, what's the lesson here? What did we learn from Jack and his big tree fight with Karen? It's a cool one, so listen up. Sometimes, the people who seem weak, like they can't do much, are actually the strongest ones in the room. Think about Jack. He was quiet, right? He didn't yell or scream or wave his arms around like a wild monkey. Nope, he just stayed calm, watched everything, and made a plan. He didn't need to shout or fight, he waited, smart and sneaky, and let Karen dig her own hole. And wow, did she fall in deep. Then there's the other side, people like Karen, who think they can push everybody around. They walk tall, talk loud, and act like they're the boss of the world. But guess what? They don't see the payback coming. Karen thought she was winning when she cut down Jack's tree. She smiled and clapped like she'd won a big prize. But Jack had a surprise ready, and it hit her hard. Bam! $50,000 and no more HOA crown. She never saw it coming, because she was too busy being mean. Let's think about that for a minute. Jack didn't look strong on the outside. He wasn't big or loud or scary. He was just a guy in a little yellow house, watering his garden and smiling at his tree. The neighbors called him lazy or weird because he didn't argue with Karen. They thought he was weak, like a little mouse who'd run away from a cat. But inside, Jack was tough like a superhero hiding his cape. He used his brain instead of his fists, and that made him the real winner. Karen was the opposite. She looked strong, didn't she? She had her clipboard, her rules, and her bossy voice. She marched around Maple Grove like she owned every house, every street, every blade of grass. The neighbors listened to her, scared to say no. She thought that made her powerful, like a queen on a throne. But it didn't. Being loud and mean didn't make her strong, it made her blind. She didn't see Jack's plan until it was too late, and then she lost everything. So here's the big idea: you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to fight with your hands or yell with your mouth. Sometimes, waiting and thinking is the best way to win. Jack showed us that. He didn't get mad and storm around like a tornado. He stayed cool, like a quiet river, and let Karen mess up all by herself. That's real strength, knowing when to wait and when to act. And when he did act, oh boy, it was perfect. A lawsuit, a new tree, and a neighborhood that cheered for him. That's a win you can't beat. What about you? Would you have fought back like Jack? Think about it. If someone was mean to you, like Karen was to Jack, what would you do? Would you shout and get mad right away? Maybe stomp your feet and tell them to stop? Or would you be like Jack, quiet, sneaky, waiting for the right moment to surprise them? It's fun to imagine, right? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know what you'd do. Maybe you'd be a loud fighter, or maybe you'd be a sneaky planner like Jack. Either way, you've got your own kind of strong inside you. Let's picture Jack one more time. He's sitting on his porch, sipping lemonade, looking at his new little oak tree. It's growing taller every day, reaching up to the sky with its green leaves. The sun's shining, the birds are singing, and the neighbors wave as they walk by. Karen's gone, well, not gone, but hiding in her house, far away from Jack's street. Everything's peaceful, and Jack's got that tiny smile on his face. He didn't need to be loud to win. He just needed to be smart, and that's what made him the hero. Now, think about your own life. Have you ever seen someone who seems weak but turns out super strong? Maybe a friend at school who doesn't talk much but always knows the answers. Or a kid who doesn't run fast but helps everybody anyway. That's the Jack kind of strong. It's not about muscles or noise, it's about heart and brains. And the pushy people, the ones who act like Karen? They don't always win, even if they think they will. Sooner or later, they trip over their own feet, just like she did. Here's another cool thing: Jack's story isn't just about him. It's about all of us. We've all got a little Jack inside, quiet sometimes, strong other times. Maybe you're shy like he was, or maybe you're loud but smart too. Either way, you can win your own battles, big or small. You don't need to be the tallest or the loudest in the room. You just need to know what matters to you, like Jack's tree mattered to him, and stick up for it in your own way. What if Karen had been nicer? Imagine that for a second. What if, instead of bossing Jack around, she'd said, "Hey, your tree's pretty cool. Can we work together to keep the leaves off the sidewalk?" Things would have been so different. Jack might have said yes, and they could have been friends. The tree would still be standing, and Karen wouldn't have to pay all that money. But she didn't choose nice. She chose mean, and that's why she lost. It's a good reminder: being kind can save you a lot of trouble. So, what's your tree? What's the thing you'd fight for, like Jack fought for his oak? Maybe it's your favorite toy, or your best friend, or a spot you love to play. Whatever it is, you've got the power to protect it. You can be loud if you want, or quiet like Jack, it's up to you. The trick is knowing when to wait and when to move, just like he did. Karen dug her hole because she didn't think Jack would fight back. But he did, in his own sneaky way, and it worked. Let's talk about the neighbors too. They learned something big from all this. At first, they whispered about Jack, calling him names and picking Karen's side. But when he won, they saw him different. They said sorry, helped with his new tree, and turned into real friends. That's a lesson too: sometimes people don't see the truth until it's right in front of them. Jack showed them, and now they're better for it. Maybe you've got people around you who don't get you yet. Keep being you, and they'll figure it out, just like Maple Grove did. This story's got me thinking about underdogs. That's what Jack was, an underdog. It's someone who doesn't look like a winner at first, but surprises everybody. Underdogs are the best, don't you think? They're quiet or small or different, but they've got big hearts and smart ideas. Jack was the underdog of Maple Grove, and he came out on top. That's why I love telling stories like this, because the underdog doesn't always lose. Sometimes, they win big, and it feels awesome. What do you think about that? Are you an underdog sometimes? Maybe at school or with your friends? Tell me in the comments, I bet you've got a story. And if you liked hearing about Jack and his tree, give this a thumbs up. It's fun knowing you're out there, listening and nodding along. I've got more stories where the little guy beats the big bully, so stick around, there's tons more to come. Let's imagine one last scene. It's a year later, and Jack's new tree is growing strong. He's out in his yard, planting flowers, little yellow ones that look like stars. Tommy's there, raking leaves even though there aren't many yet. Mrs. Lopez walks by, waving with her watering can. The sun's setting, painting the sky pink and orange, and the little oak stands tall, its shadow stretching across the grass. Jack looks at it and thinks, "You're my win." He didn't need to shout or punch, he just stayed true, and that was enough. That's the big takeaway, friends. You don't have to be the loudest to be the strongest. You can be quiet, wait your turn, and still come out on top. Karen didn't get that, but Jack did, and now he's got a tree and a neighborhood that love him. So next time someone pushes you around, think of Jack. Make your plan, use your smarts, and watch them trip into their own hole. You've got this. See you next time for more underdog wins. Bye for now.